The Navy dress blues were pressed to perfection when Pamela Cahanes stepped off that Greyhound bus in Orlando, Florida on the 2nd of August, 1984. She was 25 years old, fresh from boot camp graduation, carrying dreams as bright as her smile, and a single duffel bag containing everything she owned. Just 4 days later, those same dress blues would hang unworn in a modest motel room while Pamela's body lay strangled in a vacant lot in nearby Sanford. This Florida cold case would shock a community not once, but twice. First in 1984, when a beloved Navy recruit was brutally murdered just hours before she was supposed to begin training. Then again in 2019, when the arrest finally came and neighbors discovered they'd been living next door to a killer for 35 years. The man who murdered Pamela Cahanes had walked among them, worked beside them, maybe even called them friend. Thomas Garner seemed like everyone's quiet neighbor, unremarkable, dependable, the kind of person you'd trust to water your plants or collect your mail. He was a fellow Navy sailor, stationed at the same base where Pamela was headed. He had access to her schedule, her location, her vulnerability. For 3 decades, he built a normal life in Jacksonville while Pamela's family lived with an open wound that refused to heal. Her mother, Dorothy, held vigils every the 5th of August, pleading with anyone who would listen. Someone knows something, someone saw something, someone has to care enough to come forward. The breakthrough didn't come from a witness or a confession. It came from science that didn't exist in 1984 forensic genealogy that could trace DNA through family trees spanning generations. What investigators couldn't solve with traditional detective work, genetic databases finally revealed. But here's what haunts everyone who knew this case. How many times did Pamela's killer walk past her memorial? How often did he see her family's pleas for justice on the evening news? Did he ever feel safe, or did he spend 35 years waiting for this knock on his door? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The summer heat shimmered off the tarmac at Naval Training Center Great Lakes as families gathered for graduation day, July 1984. Dorothy Cahanes adjusted her best dress and smoothed her graying hair, watching her daughter Pamela stand tall in formation with her fellow recruits. At 25, Pamela was older than most of the young sailors around her, but her determination had carried her through every challenge boot camp could throw at her. "That's my girl," Dorothy whispered to her husband Frank, squeezing his weathered hand. They'd driven 12 hours from their small Ohio town to watch their daughter achieve something they'd never dreamed possible for a working-class family like theirs. Pamela's eyes scanned the crowd until she found her family's faces, breaking into that infectious smile that had charmed everyone, from drill instructors to fellow recruits. She'd always been the responsible one, the daughter who called home every Sunday without fail, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who put others before herself. Joining the Navy had been her way of building something meaningful with her life while serving something bigger than herself. The commanding officer's voice boomed across the parade ground, speaking of honor, duty, and service to country. Pamela stood straighter, if that was possible, her dress blues crisp in the afternoon sun. She'd struggled with self-doubt during training, wondering if she was smart enough, tough enough, worthy enough to wear the uniform. But here she was, graduated and ready for the next phase of her naval career. As the ceremony concluded and families rushed to embrace their newly minted sailors, Dorothy held Pamela tight, breathing in the scent of her daughter's regulation shampoo. "I'm so proud of you, honey. Your grandmother would have been beside herself with joy." "I know, Mom," Pamela said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can feel her watching over me." That evening, Pamela called home from the base payphone, her voice crackling through the long-distance connection. "I leave for Orlando tomorrow morning, Mom. Naval Training Center there for technical school. I should be there by Friday evening." "You be careful down there in Florida, sweetheart," Dorothy said. "Call us as soon as you get settled." "I will, Mom. I promise. I love you." Those would be among the last words Dorothy would ever hear her daughter speak. The Greyhound station in Chicago bustled with travelers at 6:30 a.m. on the 1st of August, 1984. Pamela shouldered her duffel bag and found her seat by the window, watching the industrial landscape of Illinois give way to Indiana farmland. She'd packed light uniforms, a few civilian clothes, her Navy technical manuals, and postcards to send home to family and friends. The bus made its way south through Kentucky and Tennessee, stopping every few hours to let passengers stretch their legs and grab snacks from vending machines. Pamela struck up conversations with fellow travelers, an elderly woman visiting grandchildren in Atlanta, a college student heading home to Tampa, a businessman who told stories about his Navy service in Korea. "You picked a good career, young lady," the veteran told her somewhere outside of Nashville. "Navy'll teach you skills you can use the rest of your life." Pamela smiled and nodded, reviewing her training materials while the countryside rolled past. She was scheduled to report to Naval Training Center Orlando on Monday morning, the 6th of August, for electronics technician school. The program would last several months, after which she'd receive her first permanent assignment. Everything was falling into place exactly as she'd planned. As the bus crossed into Florida, the landscape changed to palmetto scrub and orange groves. The humidity hit like a wall when they stopped in Gainesville, but Pamela didn't mind. This was her new beginning, her chance to prove herself worthy of the uniform she'd worked so hard to earn. She wrote a postcard to her parents. "Florida is beautiful. Can't wait to start school on Monday. We'll call tonight. Love, Pam." The Orlando Greyhound station was smaller than she'd expected, but clean and well lit. Pamela checked the schedule for buses to Sanford, the small town north of Orlando, where she'd found an affordable motel near the naval base. A taxi would be faster but more expensive, and she was trying to stretch her boot camp pay until her first school paycheck arrived. The townhouse motel sat on a quiet street, lined with palm trees and modest houses. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and cheap, and the elderly desk clerk had been friendly when Pamela called to make a reservation. She paid for a week in advance, figuring she'd find something more permanent once school started. Room 15 was small but comfortable, with a double bed, a dresser, and a window air conditioning unit that rattled but kept the Florida heat at bay. Pamela unpacked her few belongings, hung her uniforms in the tiny closet, and called home as promised. "I made it safely, Mom," she said. "The motel's nice, and everyone here seems really friendly." Betty Morgan had been working the front desk at the townhouse motel for 15 years, and she prided herself on remembering every guest's name and story. When the polite young Navy woman checked in on the 3rd of August, Betty immediately took a liking to her. There was something special about Pamela Cahanes, a warmth and genuine kindness that reminded Betty of her own daughter, killed in a car accident 5 years earlier. "First time in Florida, honey?" Betty asked as Pamela filled out the registration card in her neat handwriting. "Yes, ma'am. I'm starting school at the naval base on Monday. Electronics technician training." Betty's face lit up. "Well, aren't you something? A lady in the Navy. My late husband would have gotten a kick out of that. He was Navy in World War II. Over the next 2 days, Pamela and Betty developed an easy friendship. Pamela would stop by the office each morning and evening, chatting about the weather, asking for directions, or just listening to Betty's stories about old Sanford. The older woman gave her restaurant recommendations, told her about the bus routes to the naval base, and warned her about the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled through central Florida every summer day. On Saturday morning, the 4th of August, Pamela walked to the naval base to get oriented. She met with administrative staff, received her housing assignment for when school started, and picked up her class schedule and textbooks. The base was impressive modern buildings, well-maintained grounds, and hundreds of sailors going about their duties. She felt proud to be joining their ranks. That evening, she had dinner at Mel's Diner, a local restaurant Betty had recommended. The waitress, a woman about Pamela's age, complimented her northern accent and asked about her plans. Pamela found herself opening up about her hopes for her Navy career, her close relationship with her family, and her excitement about starting school. "You seem like good people," the waitress said, refilling Pamela's coffee. "We need more folks like you around here." Pamela returned to the motel around 8 p.m., stopping by the office to chat with Betty as had become their routine. "Big day tomorrow," she said. "Final preparations before I report for duty Monday morning." "You get yourself a good night's sleep, honey," Betty said. "And don't you be nervous about Monday. You're going to do just fine." But Pamela never made it to Monday. She never got to start electronics technician school, never received her first permanent assignment, never got to build the naval career she dreamed about since she was a little girl, listening to her grandfather's Navy stories from World War I. Sunday, the 5th of August, 1984, dawned clear and humid in Sanford, Florida. Pamela woke early, showered, and dressed in jeans and a light blouse civilian clothes for her final day of freedom before beginning her military training schedule. She had breakfast at the motel's small coffee shop, making conversation with the cook, a friendly Cuban man who asked about her plans for the Navy. "My nephew, he's in the Navy too," the cook said, sliding her eggs and toast across the counter, stationed in San Diego. "Says it's good life if you work hard." "That's what I'm hoping for," Pamela replied, adding cream to her coffee. "I start school tomorrow morning." After breakfast, she spent time at the motel pool, reading technical manuals and enjoying the morning sunshine. A family from Georgia was also staying at the motel, parents with 2 young children heading to Disney World. Pamela helped their little girl retrieve a ball that had rolled into the deep end, and the mother thanked her profusely. "Are you from around here?" the mother asked. "No, I'm from Ohio, here for Navy school." "Well, bless your heart. Thank you for your service." Around mid-morning, Pamela walked to a nearby shopping plaza. She bought shampoo and other personal items at a drugstore, picked up snacks for her dorm room, and stopped at a payphone to call home. But the line was busy. Her parents were probably at church or running errands. The heat was building as it did every Florida afternoon, so she returned to the motel and spent the early afternoon in her air-conditioned room, organizing her school materials and writing in the journal she'd kept since high school. She wrote about her excitement for starting school, her gratitude for Betty's kindness, and her hopes for the future. Late in the afternoon, around 5 p.m., several guests saw Pamela return to the motel from another walk around the neighborhood. She waved to an elderly man sitting outside his room and greeted Betty through the office window. She appeared relaxed and happy, looking forward to the next chapter of her life. That was the last confirmed sighting of Pamela Cahanes alive. Whatever happened to her in the hours that followed would remain a mystery for 35 years, haunting everyone who had met her during those final days in Sanford. The young woman with the infectious smile and unwavering determination simply vanished into the Florida night, leaving behind only questions and a family whose lives would never be the same. Robert Hayes had been a sanitation worker for the city of Sanford for 15 years, and he knew every street, every alley, every vacant lot on his route. Monday morning, the 6th of August, 1984, started like any other, up at 5:30 a.m., coffee and toast, then out to his truck by 6:15. The route took him through residential neighborhoods, past small businesses, and around the undeveloped lots that dotted the growing community. At 6:47 a.m., Robert was working his way through the vacant lot on Garrison Drive, collecting the weekend's accumulation of litter, when he saw something that made his blood freeze. Partially hidden among the weeds and debris was what looked like a person, a young woman wearing jeans and a light-colored blouse, lying motionless in an unnatural position. Robert's hands shook as he approached. He'd seen car accidents before, helped at house fires, but nothing had prepared him for this. The woman was clearly dead, her body bearing obvious signs of violence. He backed away, his breakfast threatening to come up, and ran to his truck where he kept a radio for emergencies. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, he said, his voice cracking. "I need police and paramedics at the vacant lot on Garrison Drive, between Pine Street and Oak Avenue. I've found a body, female. She's been hurt real bad." The first Sanford police officer arrived within minutes, followed quickly by Seminole County Sheriff's deputies. The scene was secured with yellow tape while detectives and crime scene technicians were called in. By 9 a.m., the vacant lot buzzed with law enforcement activity, photographers documenting the scene, evidence technicians collecting samples, detectives interviewing Robert and canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses. Detective Lieutenant Mike Harris of the Seminole County Sheriff's Office surveyed the scene with the grim experience of 20 years in law enforcement. The victim appeared to be in her 20s, with dark hair and a slight build. Her clothes were disheveled, and there were obvious signs of sexual assault and strangulation. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was the work of a predator. The medical examiner arrived around 10 a.m. and began his preliminary examination. "Cause of death appears to be manual strangulation," he told Harris quietly. "Signs of sexual assault and blunt force trauma. She's been dead at least 6 to 8 hours, maybe longer." Harris nodded grimly. They were dealing with a brutal murder, and the clock was already ticking. The first 48 hours of any homicide investigation were crucial. After that, leads went cold, witnesses forgot details, and physical evidence deteriorated. The victim carried no identification, but her clothing and jewelry provided some clues. Her jeans were a popular brand sold at department stores throughout the region. Her earrings appeared to be gold-plated, inexpensive but well-maintained. She wore a high school class ring from 1977, suggesting she was around 25 years old. By early afternoon, investigators had connected the victim to the townhouse motel. Betty Morgan's description matched the body in the vacant lot, and the registration card provided the name that would haunt Sanford for the next 37 years, Pamela Rose Cahanes. Detective Mike Harris sat in his unmarked Ford outside the townhouse motel, dreading the phone call he had to make. In 20 years of police work, notifying next of kin never got easier. The number on Pamela's registration card was in Ohio, her parents, most likely. He dialed carefully, listening to the long-distance connection crackle to life. "Hello?" A woman's voice, cheerful and unsuspecting. "Mrs. Cahanes? This is Detective Lieutenant Mike Harris with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office in Florida. Are you the mother of Pamela Rose Cahanes?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt like hours. "Yes," Dorothy finally whispered. "Is she? What's happened to my daughter?" Harris had delivered this news hundreds of times, but it never got easier. "Mrs. Cahanes, I'm very sorry to have to tell you that your daughter was found deceased this morning. She was the victim of a homicide." Dorothy's scream pierced the phone line, followed by the sound of the phone dropping. Harris could hear Frank Cahanes in the background, asking what was wrong, then his own anguished cry when Dorothy managed to tell him. After several minutes, Frank came on the line, his voice hollow with shock. "Detective, are you sure it's Pamela? Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes, sir. She was identified through her motel registration. I know this is an incredible shock, and I'm very sorry for your loss. We're going to do everything in our power to find who did this to your daughter." Within hours, the story hit the local news. Navy recruit murdered in Sanford. The Naval Training Center confirmed that Petty Officer Recruit Cahanes had been scheduled to begin electronics technician school that morning. Her absence had been noted, but administrative staff assumed she'd been delayed or had transportation problems not uncommon for students arriving from out of state. The investigation kicked into high gear. Every guest at the Townhouse Motel was interviewed. The Naval Training Center provided a list of all personnel who might have had access to information about incoming students. Neighborhood canvases turned up several residents who had seen Pamela walking around town over the weekend, but no one reported seeing her with anyone suspicious. Betty Morgan was devastated. She was such a sweet girl, she told Harris through tears. So polite and friendly, who could do such a terrible thing to someone like her? The crime scene yielded physical evidence, hair fibers, fingerprints, and biological samples that would be tested using the forensic technology available in 1984. DNA testing was still years away from being standard in criminal investigations, so investigators relied on blood typing, fingerprint analysis, and witness statements. By evening, Pamela's family had arrived in Orlando, flying in from Ohio in a daze of grief and disbelief. Harris met them at the airport with victim services advocates, beginning a relationship that would span decades. Dorothy Cahanes looked at him with eyes red from crying and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Promise me you'll find who did this to my baby. Promise me you won't give up." Harris made that promise, not knowing it would take 37 years to keep. The Seminole County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit had handled dozens of homicide cases, but the Cahanes murder quickly consumed all available resources. Detective Harris assembled a team of investigators and set up a command post with a bulletin board displaying crime scene photos, witness statements, and a growing list of potential suspects. The first week of investigation was intense and hopeful. Every guest at the Townhouse Motel was thoroughly interviewed and cleared. The Naval Training Center provided complete personnel records for anyone who might have known about Pamela's arrival. The neighborhood canvass expanded to include everyone within a 2-mile radius of the crime scene. Thomas Garner was interviewed on the 9th of August, 3 days after the murder. He sat across from Harris in a small conference room at the naval base, appearing nervous but cooperative. At 26, Garner was a petty officer second class with 4 years of naval service. His personnel record was clean, no disciplinary actions, good performance evaluations, considered reliable by his supervisors. "Did you know Petty Officer Recruit Cahanes?" Harris asked. "No, sir. I knew she was scheduled to arrive for ET school, but I never met her personally." "How did you know about her arrival?" "It was on the weekly roster. We all knew there were new students starting Monday." Harris made notes in his detective's notebook, the same line pad he'd used for years, filled with handwritten observations that would prove crucial decades later. Garner's answers were consistent and unremarkable. He claimed to have spent the weekend of the 4th of August -5 at home, watching television and doing laundry. He had no alibi witnesses, but that wasn't unusual for a single sailor living alone. "Did you go anywhere that weekend? Any bars, restaurants, shopping?" "I might have gone to the grocery store Saturday. I don't really remember. It was just a regular weekend." The interview lasted 30 minutes. Harris noted that Garner seemed genuinely surprised by the questions and appeared to have no knowledge of the murder beyond what had been reported on the news. Like dozens of other naval personnel, he was cleared and moved to the bottom of the suspect list. Meanwhile, other leads were being pursued. A registered sex offender living in nearby Winter Park was brought in for questioning but had a solid alibi. A drifter who'd been seen in the area was tracked down and interviewed, but his timeline didn't match. Several local men with histories of violence against women were investigated thoroughly and eliminated. The forensic evidence provided some clues, but no immediate answers. Blood typing showed the perpetrator was a type O male, which eliminated some suspects, but still left hundreds of possibilities. Fingerprints recovered from the scene didn't match any in the Florida Department of Law Enforcement database. As August turned to September, the momentum began to slow. The case was still a priority, but other crimes demanded attention. Harris continued working the case daily, following up on tips from the public, re-interviewing witnesses, and pursuing every possible lead. But with each passing week, he felt the trail growing colder. By late August 1984, fear had settled over Sanford like the humid air that hung motionless in the evening hours. Women who had never given a second thought to walking alone at night now double-checked their locks and asked friends to escort them to their cars. Parents kept their children closer to home, and local businesses installed better lighting and security systems. The community meeting at Sanford City Hall on the 20th of August drew over 200 residents. Police Chief Raymond Walker and Detective Harris tried to provide reassurance while being honest about the challenges of the investigation. The killer had left no witnesses, no clear motive, and few clues beyond the physical evidence that forensic technology of the era couldn't fully analyze. "What are you doing to protect us?" demanded Martha Stevens, a local teacher. "How do we know this person won't strike again?" Harris understood her fear. "We have increased patrols throughout the city, especially in the area where Miss Cahanes was found. We're working with the Navy to ensure all personnel on base are accounted for, and we're following every lead, no matter how small." Dorothy and Frank Cahanes had driven down from Ohio for the meeting. Dorothy stood at the podium, her voice steady despite her grief. "My daughter came here to serve her country. She was excited about her future, kind to everyone she met. Someone in this community knows something about what happened to her. Please, if you saw anything, heard anything, remember anything that might help, please come forward." The meeting generated several new tips, mostly reports of suspicious vehicles or strangers seen in the area around the 5th of August. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none led to a breakthrough. The case was generating statewide media coverage, and tip lines were overwhelmed with calls from well-meaning citizens who thought they might have seen something relevant. One tip seemed promising. A gas station attendant reported seeing a young woman matching Pamela's description with a man in his 20s on the evening of the 5th of August. But when shown photos, he couldn't definitively identify either person, and the lead ultimately went nowhere. The investigation expanded beyond Sanford. Similar unsolved murders in other parts of Florida were reviewed to see if there might be a serial killer operating in the region. Several cases showed similarities, but forensic technology of the 1982nd couldn't determine definitively if they were connected. By September, the task force had interviewed over 300 people and followed up on more than 500 tips. The case file was growing thick with witness statements, forensic reports, and dead-end leads. Harris was working 16-hour days, but the killer remained as elusive as smoke. The town's fears proved unfounded. No similar attacks occurred in Sanford, but that provided little comfort to residents who now understood that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. The murder had shattered their sense of security and trust in ways that wouldn't heal for decades. Pamela's case was becoming what every investigator feared most, a cold case. The 1992nd brought revolutionary changes to criminal investigation, none more significant than the development of DNA testing. Detective Maria Santos, newly assigned to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit in 1995, pulled Pamela's file from storage as part of a systematic review of all unsolved homicides from the 1982nd. The evidence collected from the crime scene in 1984 had been carefully preserved, stored in a climate-controlled facility according to the chain of custody protocols that Harris had meticulously maintained. Blood samples, hair fibers, and other biological evidence were submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory for DNA analysis. The results were both encouraging and frustrating. The lab was able to develop a complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, a type O male with specific genetic markers that could definitively identify him if his DNA was ever entered into a database. But the problem was finding him. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, where it was automatically compared against samples from convicted felons and unsolved crimes from around the country. No matches. Santos reached out to Dorothy and Frank Cahanes with the news. Dorothy was now in her 70s, her hair silver, but her determination undimmed. "Does this mean you can catch him if he commits another crime?" "Yes, ma'am," Santos replied. "If he's ever arrested for a felony and required to provide a DNA sample, we'll have him. But what if he doesn't? What if he's been careful all these years?" Santos didn't have a good answer. The DNA evidence was solid, but it was only useful if they could find someone to compare it to. The perpetrator's profile sat in databases, waiting for a match that might never come. Meanwhile, forensic genealogy was still decades away from becoming a standard law enforcement tool. The idea that DNA could be used to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives was science fiction to investigators in the 1992nd. The case received periodic attention when other cold cases were solved through DNA evidence. Each time, Dorothy would call the sheriff's office, hoping her daughter's case might be next. Santos always took her calls, providing updates on new technology and promising that Pamela's case was never forgotten. Other evidence from the scene was re-examined using improved forensic techniques. Fingerprints were enhanced and run through expanded databases. Crime scene photos were analyzed with better equipment, but the fundamental challenge remained. They knew who the killer was genetically, but they couldn't put a name to the profile. The investigation had moved from traditional detective work to a waiting game. Somewhere out there, Pamela's killer was living his life, possibly unaware that his genetic fingerprint was sitting in law enforcement databases, waiting for the right circumstances to bring him to justice. Thomas Garner, meanwhile, had retired from the Navy in 1995 and settled in Jacksonville, Florida. He worked various civilian jobs, married, and lived quietly in a modest neighborhood where neighbors considered him friendly but unremarkable. He had no idea that evidence from a crime he'd committed 11 years earlier was waiting patiently in a laboratory freezer, ready to destroy his carefully constructed normal life. The arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018 sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. For the first time, investigators had used forensic genealogy, comparing DNA profiles to public genealogy databases, to solve a decades-old cold case. The technique was revolutionary, and departments everywhere began reviewing their oldest unsolved cases to see which ones might benefit from this new technology. Detective Jake Morrison had been with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office for 8 years when he was assigned to the cold case unit in early 2018. At 34, he represented a new generation of investigators who had grown up with computers and understood the potential of genetic databases in ways that older detectives struggled to grasp. Morrison's first case assignment was reviewing all unsolved homicides from the 1,982nd to determine which might be suitable for forensic genealogy analysis. Pamela Cahanes' case jumped off the page, a complete DNA profile with no CODIS match, collected and preserved according to proper protocols. With a grieving family still seeking justice after 34 years, Dorothy Cahanes was now 81 years old and in declining health. Frank had died 3 years earlier, never knowing who killed his daughter. When Morrison called to discuss the possibility of using the new technology, Dorothy's voice was weaker than it had been in previous calls, but her determination remained strong. "Detective, I don't know how much time I have left," she said, "but I need to know who did this to my Pamela before I die. If this new science can help, please try it." The process was complex and expensive. The DNA profile had to be reformatted for genealogy databases, family trees had to be constructed from genetic matches, and potential suspects had to be researched and investigated. The sheriff's office partnered with a forensic genealogy consulting firm that specialized in cold cases. Morrison submitted the case in late 2018, understanding that the process could take months or even years. The consultant explained that they would upload the DNA profile to genealogy databases and look for genetic matches, distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA for ancestry research. From there, they would build family trees going back several generations, looking for common ancestors that might lead to the perpetrator. The work was painstakingly slow. Unlike CODIS, which looked for exact matches, forensic genealogy required analyzing partial matches and following genetic breadcrumbs through generations of family relationships. It was part science, part detective work, and part genealogy research. Dorothy called Morrison every few weeks for update. He could hear her growing frailty over the phone, but her voice always strengthened when she talked about Pamela. "She was going to do great things, Detective. The Navy would have been perfect for her. She just needed someone to give her a chance." By early 2019, the forensic genealogy analysis was showing promise. Several genetic matches had been identified, and family trees were being constructed. The work was complex, following DNA through multiple generations and dozens of possible family lines, but a pattern was beginning to emerge that pointed toward a specific family group in the southeastern United States. February 2019 marked a turning point in the investigation that had consumed 3 decades. The forensic genealogy analysis had narrowed the search to a specific family line, and one name kept appearing in the research: Thomas Edward Garner, retired Navy petty officer, resident of Jacksonville, Florida. Detective Morrison reviewed Garner's background with growing excitement. The man was 61 years old, had served in the Navy from 1980 to 1995, and had been stationed at Naval Training Center Orlando from 1983 to 1985. He would have been 26 at the time of Pamela's murder and would have had access to information about incoming students like her. Morrison pulled the original case file and found Detective Harris's interview notes from August 1984. There it was, Thomas Garner, interviewed as part of the routine canvass of naval personnel, cleared and dismissed after 30 minutes of questioning. The man they'd been looking for had been sitting across the table from the lead investigator 35 years ago. Surveillance of Garner began immediately. He lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet Jacksonville neighborhood with his wife of 18 years, Linda. He worked part-time at a hardware store and spent most evenings at home watching television or working in his small garden. To all appearances, he was exactly what he seemed, a retired veteran living a quiet, unremarkable life. Neighbors described him as friendly but private. "Tom's always been helpful," said one elderly woman who lived across the street. "He shoveled my driveway when it snowed, helped carry my groceries." "Never would have thought." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The challenge was obtaining Garner's DNA legally. Florida law required either consent, a search warrant based on probable cause, or collecting samples from discarded items. Morrison and his team chose the latter option, following Garner to restaurants and collecting his coffee cups and cigarette butts from public areas. The laboratory rush order took 2 weeks. On the 8th of March, 2019, Morrison's phone rang at 7:30 a.m. with the call he'd been hoping for since he'd taken the case. The DNA analyst's voice was excited but professional. "Detective, we have a match. The sample from your suspect matches the profile from the 1984 crime scene." "It's him." Morrison sat in his car outside the sheriff's office, letting the news sink in. After 35 years, they finally knew who had killed Pamela Cahanes. The friendly neighborhood retiree with the neat garden and helpful attitude was a murderer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The next step was obtaining an arrest warrant. Morrison worked with prosecutor Sarah Williams to present the evidence to a judge: the DNA match, Garner's presence at the naval base in 1984, his access to information about incoming students, and his lack of an alibi for the weekend of the murder. The warrant was signed on the 14th of March, 2019. The 15th of March, 2019, 6 a.m. Detective Morrison sat in his unmarked car outside Thomas Garner's modest Jacksonville home, watching the windows for signs of activity. A tactical team was positioned around the block, ready to move on Morrison's signal. This was the moment 3 decades of investigation had been building toward the arrest of Pamela Cahanes' killer. The neighborhood was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Sprinklers ran on automatic timers, and early commuters were beginning their morning routines. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Dorothy Cahanes was 81 and in failing health. This arrest needed to go perfectly. She deserved to see justice done while she was still alive to witness it. At 6:15 a.m., a light came on in the Garner house. Morrison gave the signal, and officers moved into position. He approached the front door with 2 other detectives, their weapons holstered but ready. The knock was firm but professional. Thomas Garner answered the door in his bathrobe, looking confused and sleepy. He was a small man, maybe 5'6" and 160 pounds, with thinning gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He looked like everyone's harmless grandfather, not a brutal killer who had evaded justice for 35 years. "Thomas Garner?" Morrison asked, showing his badge. "Yes, that's me." "Is something wrong, officers?" "Mr. Garner, I'm Detective Morrison with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office. You're under arrest for the murder of Pamela Rose Cahanes." Morrison began reading the Miranda rights as Garner's face went white with shock. "What? Who is Pamela Cahanes? There must be some mistake." But even as Garner protested his innocence, Morrison could see recognition in his eyes. After 35 years of freedom, the retired sailor knew exactly why police were at his door. The careful facade of normalcy he'd built was crumbling in real time. Linda Garner appeared behind her husband, clutching a coffee mug with shaking hands. "Tom, what's happening?" "What do they want?" "Ma'am, your husband is being arrested in connection with a 1984 murder in Sanford, Florida," Morrison explained gently. "We have a search warrant for your home as well." Linda's coffee mug shattered on the floor as the reality hit her. The man she'd been married to for 18 years, the quiet retiree who helped neighbors with their groceries and tended his garden religiously, was accused of murder. The coffee spread across the tile floor like a dark stain, and Morrison couldn't help thinking it looked like blood. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion of police cars and flashing lights. They watched in stunned silence as Thomas Garner was handcuffed and placed in the back of Morrison's patrol car. These were people who had lived next to a killer for years without knowing it, who had trusted him with their spare keys and invited him to block parties. "He seemed like such a normal guy," one neighbor told a local news reporter later that day. It was the same thing people always said when evil was finally exposed in their midst. The Jacksonville jail booking process was routine for Thomas Garner until the moment he was fingerprinted. 35 years earlier, those same fingerprints had been collected at the Pamela Cahanes crime scene, but 1984 technology couldn't match them to any suspect. Now, they would be entered into databases that hadn't existed when he committed murder, permanent digital evidence of his capture. Garner's attorney, a public defender named Richard Walsh, arrived at the jail within hours of the arrest. Walsh had handled many murder cases, but few with this kind of media attention. The story was already breaking on local news stations. 35-year-old cold case solved, Navy veteran arrested for 1984 murder. Morrison called Dorothy Cahanes from his office that evening. Her voice was weak. She'd been in and out of the hospital recently with heart problems, but it strengthened when he delivered the news she'd waited 35 years to hear. "We arrested him this morning, Mrs. Cahanes. Thomas Edward Garner, age 61, retired Navy. He was stationed at the base where Pamela was supposed to report for school." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison wondered if she was still there. Finally, she spoke. "Detective, I'm 81 years old. I've been waiting for this call since 1984. I never thought I'd live to see this day. Yes, ma'am. The DNA evidence is conclusive. This is the man who killed your daughter. What happens now? He'll be extradited to Seminole County to face first-degree murder charges. The prosecutor will be in touch with you about the trial. After Morrison hung up, he sat in his office looking at Pamela's graduation photo, which had been pinned to the caseboard for months. She was smiling in her navy dress blues, full of hope for the future. She'd been dead longer than she'd been alive, but finally, her killer would face justice. The arrest made national news. True crime podcasters and television shows picked up the story, fascinated by the combination of forensic genealogy, military connections, and the decades-long wait for justice. Garner's booking photo appeared on front pages across Florida, showing a tired-looking elderly man who bore little resemblance to the 26-year-old sailor who had murdered Pamela Cahanes in 1984. Public reaction was swift and angry. Social media posts called Garner a monster who had been hiding in plain sight. His Jacksonville neighbors were interviewed by reporters, expressing shock and betrayal. Several mentioned that their children had played in Garner's yard, that their wives had accepted rides from him, that they'd trusted him with house keys during vacation. Linda Garner hired her own attorney and filed for divorce within a week of the arrest. Through her lawyer, she issued a statement saying she'd had no knowledge of her husband's past and would cooperate fully with the investigation. The marriage she'd believed was built on 18 years of trust and companionship had been founded on deception and hidden violence. Garner's first court appearance was scheduled for the 22nd of March, 2019. He would be formally charged with first-degree murder and held without bail pending extradition to Seminole County. The Seminole County Courthouse was packed on the 15th of February, 2021, as jury selection began for the trial of Thomas Edward Garner. 2 years had passed since his arrest, with delays caused by legal motions, discovery disputes, and the COVID-19 pandemic that had shuttered courts for months. Dorothy Cahanes had lived to see this day, though at 83, she was frail and needed a wheelchair to attend proceedings. Prosecutor Sarah Williams had spent those 2 years building an airtight case. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. The chances of the profile belonging to someone other than Garner were 1 in several billion. But Williams knew that defending against decades-old evidence would be the heart of Garner's defense strategy. Defense attorney Richard Walsh argued that DNA evidence could be contaminated or degraded after 37 years. He questioned the chain of custody, the reliability of 1,984 collection methods, and the accuracy of forensic genealogy techniques. His strategy was simple: create reasonable doubt about the scientific evidence, since there were no living witnesses and little traditional evidence linking Garner to the crime. The jury selection process took 3 days. Williams wanted jurors who understood science and technology but weren't intimidated by complex DNA testimony. Walsh sought jurors who might be skeptical of genetic evidence and sympathetic to an elderly defendant who appeared harmless in court. Opening statements began on the 18th of February. Williams stood before the jury, pointing to a blown-up photograph of Pamela in her navy dress blues. This case is about a young woman who came to Florida to serve her country and start a new life. Instead, she became the victim of a brutal murder that went unsolved for 37 years. The evidence will show that the defendant, Thomas Garner, used his position at the naval base to identify and target Pamela Cahanes, then killed her in the most heinous way imaginable. Walsh's opening was brief and focused on reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is an innocent man who has been wrongly accused based on questionable scientific evidence. The prosecution will try to convince you that DNA collected 37 years ago can reliably identify someone today. But evidence degrades, mistakes happen, and innocent people can be convicted based on flawed forensic techniques. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Morrison testified about the forensic genealogy breakthrough that led to Garner's identification. Crime scene technicians from 1,984 explained how evidence was collected and preserved. DNA experts walked the jury through the testing process, explaining how genetic profiles are developed and compared. The most powerful testimony came from Detective Mike Harris, now retired but still sharp at 78. He read from his original interview notes with Garner, describing how the defendant had access to information about incoming Navy students and had no alibi for the weekend of the murder. In 30 years of police work, Harris told the jury, I interviewed thousands of suspects. Most of them were obviously guilty or obviously innocent. Thomas Garner was different. He was calm, prepared, and gave answers that were just detailed enough to seem truthful without providing any information that could be verified. Dorothy Cahanes was helped to the witness stand on the trial's 4th day. Her voice was weak, but her message was clear. Pamela was my heart, my joy, my pride. She wanted to serve her country and make something of herself. This man took all of that away, not just from Pamela, but from everyone who loved her. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict. On the 25th of February, 2021, the foreman stood and announced the decision that had been 37 years in the making. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Edward Garner, guilty of murder in the first degree. Dorothy Cahanes collapsed in her wheelchair, overcome with emotion she'd been holding back for nearly 4 decades. Morrison felt tears he didn't know he'd been holding back. Defense attorney Walsh put his arm around Garner, who sat stunned and silent as his carefully constructed life of deception finally crumbled completely. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the 15th of March, 2021, exactly 2 years after Garner's arrest. Florida law required either life in prison without possibility of parole or death for first-degree murder. Prosecutor Williams announced she would seek life imprisonment, citing Garner's age and the wishes of the victim's family. Dorothy Cahanes was wheeled to the witness stand for her victim impact statement. Her voice was stronger than it had been during the trial, powered by the satisfaction of finally seeing justice done. Thomas Garner, you took my daughter's life when she was 25 years old. You took her dreams, her future, her chance to make the world better. You took 37 years from my family, 37 years of wondering, hoping, praying for answers. Pamela has been gone now longer than she was alive. You stole her life, and you stole our peace. She paused, looking directly at Garner for the first time during the proceedings. But you didn't win. My daughter's case was never forgotten. The people who investigated her murder never gave up. Science caught up with you. Truth caught up with you. Justice caught up with you. Other family members spoke about the decades of pain, the unanswered questions, the fear that Pamela's killer would never be caught. They spoke about Detective Harris never giving up, about Morrison bringing new energy to the case, about the power of modern science to solve old crimes. Judge Patricia Martinez listened to every word before pronouncing sentence. Mr. Garner, the evidence in this case shows that you committed one of the most heinous crimes possible, the murder of an innocent young woman who was simply trying to build a life of service to her country. You have shown no remorse, offered no explanation, provided no closure to the family that has suffered for nearly 4 decades because of your actions. The judge paused, looking at Garner directly. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life behind bars, just as Blood. Pamela Cahanes spent the rest of her natural life in the ground because of what you did to her. Garner was led away in shackles, his face showing no emotion. He would be transferred to a maximum security prison in northern Florida, where he would likely die of old age without ever admitting his guilt or explaining why he had destroyed so many lives. Outside the courthouse, Dorothy Cahanes spoke to reporters from her wheelchair, Morrison and Williams flanking her on either side. Today, my daughter can finally rest in peace, she said, and I can finally let go of this burden I've been carrying for 37 years. The 5th of August, 2021, marked the 37th anniversary of Pamela Cahanes' murder, but for the first time since 1984, her family gathered at her grave with something they'd never had before: closure. Dorothy Cahanes had died peacefully 3 months after Thomas Garner's sentencing, finally able to let go of the burden she'd carried for nearly 4 decades. The small cemetery in Ohio where Pamela was buried had become a place of pilgrimage for people interested in cold cases and forensic genealogy. Her headstone, installed in 1984, bore the simple inscription, Pamela Rose Cahanes, 1959 to 1984, beloved daughter and Navy recruit. In 2021, the family added a small plaque, Justice Served, the 15th of March, 2021. Detective Morrison made the trip to Ohio for the anniversary service, joining Pamela's surviving siblings and cousins around her grave. He carried with him a folded American flag, the one that had been presented to the family at her funeral in 1984, now joined by a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, recognizing her service and sacrifice. The case had transformed Morrison's career and perspective on cold case investigation. He'd become a national speaker on forensic genealogy, helping other departments solve decades-old murders using the same techniques that had identified Garner. The Cahanes case was now taught in law enforcement academies as an example of how persistence, proper evidence preservation, and new technology could deliver justice no matter how much time had passed. In Jacksonville, Thomas Garner's house had been sold by his ex-wife and demolished by the new owners. The lot sat empty, the only remaining trace of his presence being the oak tree he'd planted in the backyard 20 years earlier. Neighbors still spoke about the shock of learning they'd been living next to a murderer, and several families had moved away, unable to reconcile their memories of the helpful retiree with the reality of his crimes. The case had broader implications for law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Forensic genealogy was becoming a standard tool for cold case investigation, with databases growing larger and more sophisticated each year. Privacy advocates raised concerns about genetic surveillance, but families of victims argued that justice for the dead should outweigh privacy concerns for the living. Pamela's story was featured in true crime documentaries, podcasts, and television shows, introducing new generations to her case and the power of modern forensic science. But for those who had known and loved her, she was never just a case study or cautionary tale. She remained the bright, determined young woman who had dreamed of serving her country and making something meaningful of her life. As the sun set on the anniversary service, Pamela's nephew placed fresh flowers on her grave, white roses, her favorite, and small American flags honoring her service. Detective Morrison stood quietly for a moment, thinking about the long journey from that August morning in 1984, when Robert Hayes found her body in a Sanford vacant lot, to this peaceful cemetery where she finally rested with dignity and justice. The inscription on her headstone caught the evening light: "Justice served." It had taken 37 years, but truth had finally caught up with deception. Science had overcome time, and a family's love had proven stronger than a killer's secrets. Pamela Rose Cahanes was no longer just a cold case. She was a young woman who had served her country even in death, helping to advance forensic science and ensuring that other families might not have to wait as long for answers. Her legacy would live on in every cold case solved through forensic genealogy, every family given closure, every killer who thought time would protect them from justice.